The day the preacher came to the dusty little town of Abilene Creek, the wind carried a mournful song across the plains. It whispered through the cottonwoods and tugged at the hem of Mary Collins's faded dress as she stood beside a man she barely knew, her hands trembling in her father's iron grip. 19 years old, cheeks pale as cream, she had never imagined her wedding day would be anything like this. No lace, no laughter, no music. Only the tired eyes of a man named Eli Turner, a poor farmer with sun-browned skin and a quiet way about him. Her father had arranged it after the drought took their cattle and debts came knocking. A good man, he'd said. He'll put food on your table. But to Mary, it felt like being sold off like one of those cattle that no longer grazed their land. Eli didn't meet her eyes much. When he did, there was no hardness there, only a kind of sad gentleness, like he knew she didn't want this either. When the vows were said, and her father clapped Eli's shoulder like sealing a bargain, the townsfolk whispered among themselves. Some pitied the girl. Others envied her quiet fortune. After all, a man with his own land, no matter how small, was better than a spinster's life. But Mary didn't hear much. She was thinking of her mother's old Bible, tucked under her pillow, and how her mother used to say God had plans even when the world seemed cruel. She looked at Eli then, standing a step away, hat in hand, saying little. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, held a strange sorrow, as if he carried a weight he never spoke of. And somehow that hurt her more than the forced vows. She wondered what kind of man could be both so quiet and so kind enough to make her feel guilty for resenting him. The wagon ride to his homestead stretched under a copper sky. Dust swirled around the wheels and silence hung heavy between them. Eli spoke only once, to offer her water from a dented canteen. "It's a long way yet," he said softly. His voice was deep, the kind that rolled like distant thunder but never struck. She nodded, unable to find words. She'd expected him to be rough, perhaps proud of having a wife, but he wasn't. He drove the team steady and slow, glancing her way as if afraid she'd vanish. The land grew lonelier as they went. No more fences, no more neighbors, just endless plains and a little house crouched beneath a cottonwood tree, its roof patched with tin. "Home," he said simply. She looked at it and felt her heart sink. It was small, plain, lonely. But she saw a garden patch, neat rows of corn and beans, and a porch swept clean. Someone had tried to make this place gentle. Inside, everything smelled of cedar and soap. There was a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the wall, and a quilt folded neatly at its foot. Her chest tightened at the sight of it, a single bed. He noticed her look and said quickly, "You can take the bed tonight, Miss Collins." She blinked, startled that he still called her Miss. "It's Turner now," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. He nodded once, his jaw tightening, but there was no anger in it. "Aye, but it don't feel right yet, does it?" he murmured almost to himself. That night, when he went to the barn to tend the horses, she sat by the window watching the moon rise over the plains, her wedding ring heavy on her hand. She thought about the life she'd left, her father's house, her sisters, the familiar sound of the creek, and wondered if they missed her. The silence of that little cabin was louder than any storm. When Eli came back, he didn't touch her. Didn't even cross the room. He placed a folded note on the table and went to lie on a pallet near the door. She hesitated, then opened it. His handwriting was rough but careful. "You don't owe me anything. I'll not ask you to share what you don't give." Tears welled in her eyes, surprising her. No man had ever spoken to her heart before. Not like that. She turned the lamp down low and lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing his slow, steady breathing. Somewhere between exhaustion and sorrow, she whispered into the dark, "Why are you so kind to me?" But he didn't answer. Maybe he was asleep. Or maybe he just didn't know how to say that he understood what it was like to be forced into something by life's cruel hands. Outside, coyotes sang under a sliver of moon, and the wind rattled the windows. Mary thought of how her life had changed in a single day. One morning a daughter, that night a wife. Yet something in her heart, small as a seed, wondered if maybe this quiet man with calloused hands and gentle eyes wasn't her punishment at all, but her beginning. She didn't believe in love at first sight, not in this world of dust and debt, but she did believe in kindness. And kindness, she thought as she drifted into sleep, was the one thing that could bloom even in barren soil. Morning came with a pale, rose-colored light spilling through the small window, and for the first time since leaving her father's house, Mary didn't hear shouting or the sound of debts being argued over. Only the low hum of bees near the wildflowers and Eli's quiet footsteps outside. She rose slowly, the air cool against her bare arms, and found that he'd already left a small breakfast on the table. Coffee, hard bread, and a bit of honey. The gesture struck her as oddly tender for a man she hardly knew. She ate in silence, then peered out the window to see him by the barn, mending a broken fence rail. He worked with steady hands, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sunlight glinting off the sweat on his forearms. There was no wasted motion, no curses or impatience, just quiet labor, as if he'd long ago made peace with solitude. She watched him for a long time, wondering what sort of man fixed fences before breakfast instead of talking to his new wife. Days turned into a rhythm of silence and soft gestures. Eli would rise before dawn, see to the animals, work the fields, and bring in firewood. Mary began tending the house, washing clothes by the creek and keeping the kitchen clean, though there wasn't much to cook. At first they spoke little, short words about chores, weather, and meals. Yet somehow that silence began to change its shape. It stopped feeling like distance and started to feel like understanding. Sometimes she caught him glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking. Quick, fleeting looks that said more than any word he could muster. She began to see things she hadn't noticed before. The way he paused by the old apple tree each morning, touching the trunk like it was a grave marker. The way he always left one plate untouched at supper, staring at it for a few seconds before finally putting it away. There was sorrow in him, quiet but deep, like a wound that never fully healed. It was on a rainy afternoon that she finally asked. He'd come in soaked from fixing a roof tile, and she handed him a dry towel. "You don't have to keep that plate set," she said softly, her voice trembling a little. He froze, then looked at her with eyes that suddenly seemed much older. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That was for my wife," he said quietly. "Before you." Her heart dropped. She hadn't known. No one had told her he'd been married before. She wanted to apologize, to take the words back, but he shook his head. "She's been gone 3 winters now. Fever took her fast. I keep forgetting to stop remembering." His voice cracked near the end, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw his pain like an open wound, raw, honest, unhidden. Something inside her shifted then. The resentment she'd carried began to melt away, replaced by something she couldn't name. Not yet. That night she made stew for the first time, using what little they had, beans, corn, and a pinch of salt. It wasn't much, but she laid 2 bowls out instead of 1 and said quietly, "For both of us." He hesitated, then sat across from her, his hands clasped like a man at prayer. They ate in silence, but it was a different silence than before, softer, warmer. When they finished, he thanked her, his voice rough with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." She smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the rim of her bowl. "Maybe I did." It was the first smile he'd seen from her, and it hit him like sunrise after a long storm. He didn't say anything more, but when he stood to stoke the fire, his shoulders didn't seem so burdened anymore. As the weeks passed, small changes took root. Mary began to hum while she worked. Eli started leaving fresh flowers on the table every Sunday, even when the fields were bare. One evening, he showed her how to ride the old chestnut mare that had belonged to his first wife. "She's gentle," he said, guiding her hand to the reins. Mary's laughter, soft, surprised, broke through the evening air, and Eli smiled for the first time in a long while. It was a small smile, barely there, but it made her heart ache in ways she couldn't explain. Later that night, as the sky turned silver with moonlight, she stood by the window again and thought how strange it was that kindness could grow between 2 strangers forced together by circumstance. She had expected to hate him, to long for escape. Instead, she found herself dreading the thought of ever leaving that quiet little cabin. One morning, as she hung linens to dry, a wagon rattled down the trail. A stranger climbed down, a man in a long brown coat, dust on his boots, a scar across his cheek. He tipped his hat to her. "Morning, ma'am. Is Eli Turner home?" She nodded, calling for him, and Eli came from the barn, wiping his hands. The man smiled, but his eyes held something cold. "Didn't expect to find you married again so soon," he said. Eli's jaw tightened. "I don't owe you talk, Grady." Mary stood still, heart thudding. The man looked her over, then chuckled low. "Guess you don't know, huh?" Eli stepped forward, voice sharp. "You've said enough." The stranger shrugged and tipped his hat again. "Just passing through." But the past don't stay buried forever, Turner. With that, he mounted and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and dread behind. Mary didn't ask right away. But that night, as they sat by the fire, she finally said, "Who was he?" Eli stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "Someone I used to work with. Back when I wasn't this." He gestured around the cabin. "Back when I was trying to be something else." She waited, but he said no more. His eyes were distant again, lost somewhere years away. She wanted to reach out to touch his hand, but she stopped herself. The past was like a sleeping bear. You never woke it unless you were ready for the claws. Still that night, when he went to his pallet, she whispered to him softly, "You're not that man anymore. Whatever you were before, you're not him now." He didn't answer, but she heard him let out a long, shaking breath. Outside, the rain began to fall, and for the first time since her wedding day, Mary realized she didn't feel trapped anymore. She felt needed, maybe even safe. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It came down in long, steady sheets, turning the road into a river of mud and the fields into brown pools that swallowed every seed of hope. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, and Mary could hear the storm whispering against the roof like a tired lullaby. She spent most of that time mending clothes and pretending not to notice Eli's distance. Something about that stranger's visit had shaken him, and the quiet that had once felt gentle now felt haunted. She caught him staring into the flames at night, his hands tightening around his cup, his eyes somewhere far away. Finally, on the third evening, she set her sewing down and said softly, "You don't have to keep whatever it is locked away. Not from me." Her words hung in the air like fragile glass. Eli looked up slowly, rainlight flickering across his face. "You think you'd want to know?" he asked. "Some things ain't easy to love once they're known." She met his gaze steadily. "Maybe not. But I'd rather know the truth than love a shadow." He rose from his chair, pacing once across the room before stopping near the window. The rain blurred his reflection like a ghost. "Before this place," he began, "I worked for the McGraw Ranch near the border. Not as a farmer, more like a hired hand who did what others wouldn't. Sometimes that meant riding into towns and collecting what was owed." His voice was quiet, but it carried a hard edge. "One night a man refused to pay. Things went bad, real bad. I didn't draw first, but when the dust cleared, he was dead." He paused, breathing slow. "That man was Grady's brother." Mary felt her stomach twist. "You killed him?" she whispered. He nodded once. "I went to the sheriff myself. He said it was self-defense, but a man's death don't wash clean that easy. I left, came here to start again. My wife then, Anna, she stayed by me, till the fever took her." His voice cracked and he turned away, gripping the window frame. "Since then, I've tried to live quiet, but some ghosts don't care how quiet you live." Mary sat still, her heart aching in her chest. She thought of the way he always carried sadness like a second skin, the way he avoided violence, even words that could cut. It made sense now. He was a man running not from law, but from his own guilt. She rose slowly, stepping toward him. "You did what you had to," she said. "That don't make you wicked." He laughed softly, bitterly. "No, but it don't make me good either." She reached for his hand, surprising herself. "Eli Turner, you're the kindest man I've ever known. If you'd done something unforgivable, it would show. But all I see is a man trying to make peace." He turned to her then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why are you saying this? You don't even love me." The words hit her like a hammer and she flinched, not because they were true, but because they weren't. "Don't I?" she whispered. "Maybe I didn't mean to, but I reckon I do." For a long moment he just stared at her, the storm reflected in his eyes. Then slowly he reached out, his hand trembling as it brushed her cheek. "Mary," he murmured, her name breaking in his throat. She closed her eyes, leaning into that touch. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it felt more intimate than one. The world outside howled and cried, but in that moment they stood still, two souls trying to find warmth in the wreckage of their pasts. When he finally pulled away, his voice was low. "You ought to know Grady won't let it rest. Men like him never do. He wants me to pay one way or another." She looked up at him, her jaw set. "Then he'll have to come through me first." He shook his head, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "You've got too much heart, Mary Turner." "And you've got too much guilt," she shot back. "Maybe together we'll even out." The next day the rain cleared and the plains shone like polished copper. Eli saddled the horses early and said he needed to ride into town for supplies. She wanted to go with him, but he told her gently to stay, that he'd be back before dusk. When he rode off, she watched until he was a dot on the horizon, a quiet ache twisting inside her. She spent the day cleaning, baking bread, keeping herself busy. But as the sun sank lower and he still hadn't returned, worry began to gnaw at her. Dusk came and went, and then full dark. She lit the lantern and waited, every creak of the cabin making her flinch. At last, near midnight, she heard the faint thud of hooves. She rushed to the door and froze. Eli was there, but he wasn't alone. Grady was slumped over his saddle, blood dark on his shirt. Eli's hands were red, his eyes hollow. "He found me at the general store," Eli said hoarsely. "Came at me with a knife. I tried to walk away, Mary, I did." But his voice failed him. Mary ran to help, her hands shaking as she helped him carry the lifeless body to the ground. The world spun. It all felt like a cruel dream. "They'll hang you for this," she whispered. Eli nodded, his face pale. "I know. Sheriff's coming tomorrow. I ain't gonna run this time." She grabbed his arm, tears streaking her cheeks. "You can't just give up." He looked at her, eyes soft with a strange peace. "Maybe it's time I stop running." Then, before she could speak, he reached for her hand, kissed her knuckles gently, and whispered, "You've been more mercy to me than I ever deserved." That night they didn't speak again. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, while she sat across from him, her heart breaking in slow, painful beats. When dawn came, the sound of hooves returned, this time not one but several. The sheriff and his men. Eli rose quietly, straightened his shirt, and said, "Don't cry, Mary. You said once you believe in kindness." "Hold on to that!" He turned to the door, but she ran to him, wrapping her arms around him fiercely. "If they take you, I'll follow," she whispered. He smiled, a small, trembling smile. "You've already followed me farther than I deserve." Then he stepped outside into the rising sun, leaving her in the doorway with the morning light pouring over her like fire. The sun had barely climbed over the cottonwoods when the sheriff's riders appeared. 5 men, dust-coated and stern, the kind of silence that meant business hanging around them. Mary stood on the porch, her hands twisting the hem of her apron, while Eli waited at the edge of the yard, hat in hand, shoulders straight but weary. The sheriff, an older man named Clay Benton, swung down from his horse and gave a slow nod. "Eli Turner," he said, voice flat. "We need to talk about what happened last night." Eli didn't deny a thing. "I'll come quiet," he answered simply. He handed over his gun, still warm from the morning sun. Mary wanted to scream, to beg them to listen, but Eli's calm stopped her. "He attacked me," he told Benton. "Knife still at the store. Folks saw it. But I reckon you gotta do what's right." Benton studied him for a long moment before nodding. "What's right's what the jury decides." Then they bound Eli's wrists loosely, more out of form than cruelty, and led him toward town. Mary saddled the mare and followed, heart hammering. The trail felt endless, every hoofbeat echoing like a countdown. When they reached Abilene Creek, word had already spread. People came out of shops and porches whispering. Some looked at Eli with pity, others with judgment. "That's the Turner boy," someone muttered. "Didn't he kill a man once before?" "They say it was self-defense," another replied. "But you know how stories grow." Mary felt their stares like stones. She walked beside the wagon where Eli sat under guard, her chin high, though tears stung her eyes. At the jailhouse, the sheriff unlocked the door and motioned him inside. Eli turned to her one last time. "Don't fret, Mary, it's just words and truth now." She wanted to reach for him, but the door closed between them, the click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in her chest. Inside that dim jail, Eli sat alone. Outside, Mary refused to leave. She stood on the boardwalk from dawn till dusk, bringing him food, water, anything she could. When night fell, she sat on the steps, wrapped in her shawl, whispering prayers to a God she wasn't sure still listened. Townsfolk shook their heads. "Poor girl," they said. "He's done for." But she didn't move. On the 3rd morning, the sheriff came out, hat in hand. "Mrs. Turner," he said gently, "the hearing's today. You can speak if you like." Her stomach nodded, but she nodded. Inside the small courtroom, a dozen men sat in judgment. The same men who'd once come to her father's store for sugar and flour. They listened as witnesses told their stories. The shopkeeper who'd seen Grady pull a knife first. A boy who swore he saw Eli try to back away. It should have been enough, but then someone muttered, "A man who kills twice ain't unlucky, he's dangerous." Murmurs spread like wildfire. Mary felt the tide turning. When they called her to the stand, her hands trembled. The judge asked gently, "Mrs. Turner, what kind of man is your husband?" She looked at Eli. His head bowed, hands folded, and something fierce rose inside her. "He's a man who fixes fences before breakfast," she said. "Who leaves flowers on the table every Sunday. Who won't raise his voice even when the wind tears the roof off. He killed to stay alive, not to harm. If that's a crime, then hang us both." The room went silent. The judge cleared his throat. "That's mighty brave talk, ma'am." She lifted her chin. "It ain't brave. It's the truth." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the sheriff stepped forward, laying the blood-stained knife on the table. "Found it where he said it'd be," he said quietly. "Still Grady's prints on the handle." The crowd's murmurs shifted again, this time softer, uncertain. The verdict didn't come until sundown. The jurors filed back in, faces grave. The foreman cleared his throat and said, "Not guilty." The words hit Mary like a flood. She gasped, clutching the railing, tears breaking free. Eli didn't move at first, just sat there stunned. Then he looked at her, eyes wide with disbelief, and something in his face crumbled. The sheriff nodded, cutting his bonds. "You're free to go, Turner. Guess justice found its mark today." Outside, the sky blazed orange and gold, and the townspeople stood watching as Eli stepped into the light. Mary ran to him, and for the first time he caught her in his arms. Not careful, not hesitant, but with the raw strength of a man who'd almost lost everything. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing. "It's over," she whispered. He shook his head softly. "No, it's beginning." They rode home in silence, the sunset behind them. When they reached the cabin, everything looked the same. The garden, the porch, the single bed. But it felt different, as if the storm had passed and left the air cleaner. Inside, Eli set his hat down and turned to her. "You stood for me," he said. "No one ever did that before." She smiled through her tears. "You stood for me first. The day you let me have the bed." That made him laugh, quiet and tender. Then, as dusk deepened into night, he stepped closer. "Mary," he murmured, "you sure about this life? It ain't easy." She reached up, resting a hand against his cheek. "I ain't looking for easy. I'm looking for true." And in that moment, with the cicadas singing and the smell of rain still on the wind, he kissed her, soft, slow, and trembling. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of promise, the kind that mends something broken inside. For weeks after, life found a new rhythm. They worked side by side, planted late crops, laughed more freely. Yet beneath the peace, Mary could sense a shadow, Eli's quiet glances toward the horizon, the way he tensed at distant hoofbeats. One evening she asked, "You still think about him, don't you?" Eli nodded. "A man can't kill another and not think on it. But maybe thinking means I still got a soul." She slipped her hand into his. "Then don't let it turn dark. Let it remind you what mercy feels like." He smiled faintly, eyes soft. "You're my mercy, Mary Turner." And though the words should have sounded sweet, they carried a hint of sorrow, like he was already saying goodbye to something she couldn't yet see. Summer came slow to the prairie that year. The rains faded and the land grew golden with tall grass, whispering in the wind like the memory of all they had survived. The corn sprouted strong, the cattle grew fat again, and laughter returned to the little cabin under the cottonwood tree. Mary often found herself humming while she cooked, sunlight spilling through the windows onto the worn wood floors. Sometimes she'd catch Eli watching her from the doorway, a quiet smile ghosting across his lips, and she'd tease him. "You look at me like you're still trying to figure out what I'm made of." He'd grin and reply, "I reckon I'll die trying." But as the days grew long and golden, she began to notice a weariness in him, subtle at first, then deepening. He tired faster in the fields, coughed at night when he thought she was asleep. When she asked, he brushed it off. "Just the dust is all." But dust, she knew, didn't make a man's hands shake like that. One evening, near harvest time, he didn't come in for supper. She found him sitting on the porch, head bowed, breath shallow. The sky behind him was burning orange, the sun melting into the horizon. "Eli," she whispered, kneeling beside him. He tried to smile. "Guess I ain't as strong as I used to be." She reached for his hand. It was cold, trembling. "You're scaring me," she said, voice breaking. "Don't." He looked at her then, eyes soft, steady. "Don't cry, Mary, I just need a bit of rest." But the truth was already there, painted across his face. The winter before had taken something from him, something he'd never gotten back. She helped him inside, made him lie down, sat beside him all night listening to his breathing grow faint, like wind dying across the plains. At dawn, he opened his eyes and whispered, "You gave me peace, Mary. That's more than I ever thought I'd earn." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Don't talk like that." He smiled faintly. "You remember that night I said you don't owe me anything? I was wrong. You owe me one thing." Her breath caught. "What's that?" His fingers found hers weak but warm. "Promise me you'll keep living." "Even when I don't," she shook her head fiercely, sobbing. "I can't without you." He smiled again, softer now. "You already did 'fore I ever came along." His hand slipped from hers then, his breath catching once, twice, and then stilling. The morning light touched his face gently as if heaven itself had stooped low to take him. Mary sat there, holding his hand long after it had gone cold, her tears falling onto the quilt he'd mended for her first winter there. Outside, the world went on. The hens clucked, the wind stirred the grass, but inside that cabin, time stopped. When the sheriff rode out 2 days later to check on them, he found her sitting quietly by the window, the Bible open on her lap, Eli laid out with flowers on his chest. She looked up at him with dry eyes and said, "He's home now." The sheriff removed his hat, unable to speak. They buried Eli under the cottonwood he used to touch every morning. Mary carved his name herself into a rough plank of cedar. Eli Turner, a good man who found peace. The townsfolk came, bringing bread and flowers, whispering of how the poor farmer who'd once been feared died a better man than most preachers ever lived. When the preacher asked if she wanted to say a few words, Mary stepped forward, hands trembling, voice clear. He was quiet and he was kind. He carried more sorrow than most could bear, but he never let it make him cruel. He taught me that love don't always come like a storm, it comes like a sunrise, slow and sure, and it stays even when the man you love don't. She paused, smiling through tears. I was forced to marry him, but if I could choose again, I'd still say yes. The crowd bowed their heads. Some wept. The wind moved through the grass, whispering like a blessing. That night she sat on the porch alone, the stars burning low and wide. She could almost hear him beside her. The sound of his boots on the boards, his quiet laugh, the soft murmur of, "You sure about this life?" She smiled faintly, looking out at the endless dark. "I'm sure," she whispered. "I'll keep living." And she did. The years passed. The farm grew strong under her hands. Folks said Mary Turner was the kind of woman who could grow roses in dust. Sometimes travelers would stop by and ask about the man buried under the cottonwood, and she'd tell them, "He was my husband. He saved me from a world that forgot kindness." They'd nod and she'd smile, eyes shining like someone who'd loved once and well. When she grew old and gray, they said she still sat by the window at dusk, talking to someone unseen. Maybe it was memory, maybe it was him. But those who passed by her cabin swore that in the golden hour, when the wind bent the grass and the sun bled over the plains, you could see 2 shadows on the porch, one of a woman and one of a man beside her, hat in hand, watching the horizon like he'd never left. And every spring, wildflowers bloomed beneath the cottonwood where he lay, even in the driest years, as if love itself refused to die in that patch of prairie.